Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria and Eastern Antique Arms. So you will have hopefully recently watched a second part of a restoration video looking at this Bengal cavalry officer's sword. A very nice piece, relatively rare to get these swords marked to East India Company, Honourable East India Company army regiments, dating obviously before the Indian Mutiny, because the East India Company was dissolved, I think officially in 1858, so kind of like when the mutiny was still being resolved, should we say. I should also mention, of course, we call it Indian Mutiny usually in Britain, I think in America as well, and it has been known as that for many decades, but in India today it's known as the First Indian War of Independence, rightly or wrongly. There were mutinies before the main Indian Mutiny, and there were indeed mutinies after, but anyway, so this is a very nice sword that cleaned up rather well. We first looked at cleaning the blade and the scabbard to some extent. I haven't gone too much to town on the scabbard, it has to be said. I've left it with quite a lot of patina still on. It was very rusty when I first got it. The hilt was rusty, we cleaned the rust off there, it's nicely blued underneath. We cleaned the grip up, the shagreen grip and the grip wire. So I'm all happy with that. Now, I'm putting that sword away because this video is actually about a different sword, and it's this one. Now, I have shown this sword previously, kind of fleetingly in a video, and this is in some ways a related sword. Okay, so if we take it out here, you'll notice it has a pipe back blade like the other one we looked at. It's just as rusty as the other one was, so it's got a rusty hilt and a rusty scabbard. But you'll notice the blade is a somewhat different design. If you look up near this hand at this end, you'll notice it's got this very raised false edge known as a yeoman, or indeed false edge, and this is characteristic work of Prosser, a company called, maker called John Prosser of London, Charing Cross, and this sword has the Honourable East India Company's lion on one side of the blade, as well as the maker's name down here, Prosser, and in fact it says Prosser on the other side, and very, very faint. As you can see, the blade's in quite nice condition, but the etching is very faint on it. It actually says down here, just about say it, Bombay Horse Artillery. So this is obviously an officer's sword for the Bombay Horse Artillery, which makes it a pretty rare thing in itself, and it's also rare because it's this specific style of blade that Prosser favoured, really between about the years of about 1810 through to about 1840-ish. So this style of blade is most often found on swords that date to the 1820s and 1830s and just about into the 1840s. This sword itself probably dates to the 1830s, I think, or thereabouts, maybe 1820s. It doesn't have any royal cipher on it because it's for the John Company, as they were known, the Honourable East India Company. Their army was their own army. Whilst they owed allegiance to the British Crown, they did not put British monarchs' ciphers on their blades. So I can't tell you whether this is from George IV, William IV, or Victoria, but it's one of those. My money would be on George IV or William IV. I think it's pre-Victorian. I think it's a pretty early example. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to clean this up. As you can see, the blade is pretty nice. Now, the blade has clearly been cleaned, I would say, repeatedly in its lifespan, which is why the etching is very faint. So we want to do a minimal amount to that. The first thing to do is it's got some gunk on the blade, so we're going to get the trusty old Valistol, and we're just going to give the blade a bit of a clean down, a bit of a spray, and see actually what we're working with. So get my oily rag out and give it a clean and see what's underneath this grease and grime. Well, basically I may do nothing to this blade because I've got to say it's in really good condition. It's the hilt and the scabbard which really need the attention spending on them. Right, so already I can tell you that blade is incredibly clean. Nothing that I could do to it is going to be beneficial at this point, other than giving it a good clean down like I'm doing here, with some good quality oil like Ballistol, and giving it a good old rub. I could polish it up so it was like a mirror polish, but that would be damaging to the very faint etching which is there, and I don't want to risk losing any more of the etching than has already gone. So I'm going to carry on cleaning up this blade, and we'll come back to you in a second when we're ready to start looking at the scabbard and the hilt. So I've cleaned off this blade with no more than a little bit of wire wool to get into the crevices of the near the point. It had some gunk kind of stuck. As you can see, if you've got a very strong midrib up near this point, and it had some gunk stuck in there, so I just used a little bit of wire wool just to scour that out. But generally speaking, I've cleaned this with nothing more than Ballistol oil, which is gun oil, which is very good for everything really, but it's very good for swords and of course for firearms. And oil and cloths, and I've just given it a good old buff, and then just finishing off just to get rid of any kind of harmful grease that there might be on there. There were some fingerprints on this blade, not my own, I hasten to tell you, but people had obviously been sticking their grubby fingers on the blade, and luckily the blade was quite greasy, so I hadn't really done much. But fingerprints left on blades unattended will turn into black stains, oxidization, having problems with that word, but essentially, yeah, I've just given it an oil down, a wipe down, a clean, got the dirt out of it, and it's all a nice, clean, fresh blade now. As you can see, it's in excellent condition. I'm not going to do any more to it not any more to the blade anyway than that. Now, the two main areas that require attention are the hilt and the scabbard. I'm going to put the sword aside for a little bit, and we're going to attend to the scabbard. Now, the scabbard has protected the blade very effectively, but it is covered in rust. Okay, so the way that I'm going to get to that rust is I'm going to use one of these Brillo pads. Now, generally speaking, I avoid using Brillos on swords themselves, where there might be detailing or finer elements such as the grip wire and things like that that I don't really want to damage with these sort of slightly more abrasive pads. But scabbards, I feel fine going onto a scabbard with one of these. These are slightly nicer to use than wire wool, because wire wool falls apart in your hands and gets little bits stuck in there. The rust will stain your hands, so pure vanity here really, but I do tend to stick some form of glove on, at least on one of my hands, just to prevent it from being stained brown. Because, you know, I have a day job and I have a normal life, and I don't really want to be going around everywhere with a stained brown hand. It looks a bit weird. Right, so first thing we're going to do is get some oil on this rusty old dried surface. Usually I have to say I'd use WD-40 because it's cheaper than Ballistol, but actually I don't have any WD-40 in this room with me. It's outside in my workshop, so I'm using Ballistol for now. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to soak an area with rust. Now, what you can do, what some people will recommend, is to leave that to soak in. You can do that. I'm not sure it makes a huge amount of difference. It probably makes some. Soaks into the rust, makes it a little bit more easy to free it from the metal underneath, from the steel. But anyways, just leave that for a few seconds to soak in. And then I'm going to fold up my, as some people will call it, a green scrubby or Brillo pad. And then I'm going to set to scratching in circles like this. Okay, so at intervals, just so you can see what effect you're having and whether you need to reassess how you're doing the job, just wipe off the crud, that essentially the kind of sludge, rusty sludge that'll form, and have a look and see if you're having much effect. Now, I have to say, this is some pretty tough rust, so that, just what you've seen there, hasn't removed very much at all. But the thing is, with a lot of these sorts of jobs, you've got to accept they're going to take a long time. So, you know, put the television or the radio on or whatever, and or YouTube, of course, and you know, get to it. So do it while you're doing something else. You don't even need to be looking at the thing. If you've got something like a Scabbard, I can be looking up you and talking at the same time as actually doing the job. Right, so I'm going to carry on with this for a bit. I may possibly try some other tools in my toolbox to see if they have any better effect on this particular rust. Right, so as you may have seen, I have switched to a type of brush. This is particularly tough rust, and as I've spoken about in previous videos, rust comes in different forms. I'm not exactly sure why. I'm not sure whether it's a question of what's on the surface of the metal when the rust forms, or perhaps how long the rust has been there, this type of thing. I don't really know. But some rust is much harder to shift than other rust. And whereas the previous sword we looked at, the Bengal cavalry sword, the rust came off relatively easy off that. It seemed to be quite light rust, almost as if it hadn't been there for that long. This rust is really kind of hard. I have heard, I don't know if this is completely true, but I have heard that the oxidization itself can be harder than the steel underneath in terms of hardness, in actual hardness. So not toughness, of course, but in actual hardness in terms of trying to scratch it or abrade it, in the same way that a diamond's very hard, but of course it's brittle. So I have taken to using a different tool, and that is a brush, but not the brass brush that I have used in the past. This is actually a steel brush. Now, I wouldn't usually use a steel brush on an antique, but in this case I'm applying it relatively lightly, and you have to remember, of course, it's not hugely different to using wire wool. It's wire, but it is slightly tougher wire, and being on a lever, being on a brush handle, you can apply a little bit more pressure to it and be a bit more precise to some extent as well. So I'm going to carry on a localized area, having a go with this steel brush, and then I'm going to have a look at the surface. Notice I'm testing it on one small area. If I think that it's being too abrasive, I can always make good with the wire wool on that area. But for now, I think I'm going to have to use something that's abrasive just to get through this level of tough rust. Okay, so having been going at this area of the scabbard for a little while now, my opinion is this. I mean, I can do it all with the steel brush. I probably couldn't remove that level of rust in a reasonable amount of time, in an acceptable amount of time, with wire wool. The wire wool's just not tough enough. The steel brush is doing the job, but even that's pretty slow. So what I'm going to do is something I hadn't planned to do and didn't expect to have to do actually with this. I thought the rust would come off more easily from the scabbard. is I'm actually going to use a rust removing chemical and show you that in a separate video. So what I'm going to do with the rest of this video is have a little look at cleaning the hilt of this sword, and I'm going to deal with cleaning the scabbard using a rust remover in a future video. So let's have a little look at the scabbard now, at the hilt rather. Let's have a little look at the hilt now rather than the scabbard, and I will put the scabbard aside for now for a later video. So just as previously, I'm a big fan of brass brushes. So this was a steel brush, this is a brass brush. I'm now going to have a little go at cleaning some of these guards, the sidebars to the guard, to see if the level of rust on this is as hardcore as the level of rust on the scabbard is. Remember, of course, there's much less surface area on this. So I might tolerate a greater degree of manual cleaning, but let's never write out chemical cleaning off the cards as well. So first of all, get your sword into a secure position. Obviously I'm holding this blade because it's not super sharp. I think it has been sharpened at some point, but it's not too sharp to grip now. But of course, if the sword is sharp, be very careful. Wear gloves and all that kind of stuff, or possibly even just put it in its scabbard and hold the scabbard. Right, let's have a see. Okay. So it does appear to be slightly lighter than the scabbard rust. Let's have a little go with the Brillo. Okay, first impressions are it is definitely tougher rust than we experienced on the Bengal sword. It's similar a degree of rust to what we find on the scabbard, which is of course what we would expect because both the hilt and the scabbard have been in the same environment and exposed in the same way. I'm going to stick with the brass brush for a bit, I think, and see. I'm just going to focus on just this one bar and see how far I can get just with the brass brush. I'm reluctant to use the steel brush on the hilt, just simply because there's more detail there. It's just a more delicate thing than a scabbard. Scabbards are have usually got dings and dents and scratches on them because they're scabbards. Hilts we want to keep as nice as possible. Okay, so let's try a little bit more with the brass brush. I'm just going to make one small change. I'm going to switch to another brass brush I've got, which is a kind of intermediate between the steel brush and the original brass brush. That brass, I don't know why, but it is definitely softer brush. I think it's meant for suede, so it's just a slightly more sympathetic brush. This is a brass brush, but it's kind of stiffer brass. It's a kind of harder alloy, I think. So I'm going to try with a slightly harder brass brush, not quite with the steel brush. So just to give you a little update, it's you probably won't be able to see, but maybe you will, I don't know. This is unclean, this is unclean, this is clean, so you can probably see a colour difference hopefully. And it is working, but it's slow going. It's really kind of really tough type of rust, very kind of almost ceramic in feeling. It feels a bit like trying to scratch tiling off. So it's not powdery sort of rust like I had on the Bengal cavalry sword. So I'm just going to keep going at it, nothing else I can do. Obviously there are machines that can assist with this. There are fittings you can stick on a Dremel or a drill, but my opinion, some of those are fine, but my opinion is, generally speaking, with something that's very abrasive that you need to use like a wire brush, the risks involved are quite high with a machine of overdoing it, of over-scouring, of scratching the surface, and of making a mess of it, basically. And remember, this sword has been around for nearly 200 years now, so we don't want to mess it up at this point. Okay, we take our time, try and do a decent job. We don't need to make it look, we're never going to make it look like new. There are companies that will make an antique sword look like new, but I don't really approve of that, because they have to remove quite a lot of material from the sword to do it. So let's just have a little look at where we're at now. Let's try and get the light reflecting in the right way. So hopefully you can maybe see. Let's try and... It's always the lighting is difficult. There we go. Right. So hopefully you can see the difference between uncleaned and cleaned. So we've got this really gritty kind of... It looks dusty on the surface, but it's actually really tough corrosion around here. And here I've been cleaning it off with a mixture of brushes, soft brass, hard brass, and a little bit of light steel brush as well. And you can see down here, you can see the rust in there compared to where I've been cleaning some of the rust off here. You can see that contrast there, obviously difference in colour. So yeah, it's pretty tough stuff and pretty tough going. I haven't cleaned the back strap at all yet. You can see there how much rust it's got on it. I have cleaned the pommel a little bit around here, so you may be able to see it looks much smoother around there because I've been cleaning around here, and a little bit on the bottom of the pommel as well. So I'm just going to keep at it basically, but yeah, it's slow going, as these things often are, I'm afraid. The Bengal sword in comparison was pretty easy compared to this. This one has got really thickly sort of it's crustacean-like corrosion. That being said, it doesn't seem to have damaged the guard underneath too much. It's pretty much sitting on the surface, and equally, as you can see, the shagreen is in very good condition, and all of the grip wires there as well. It's dirty, but it's all there, and the hilt construction is solid and tight, and as you can see around here, the leather washer's still in place. So actually, this sword has got a hell of a lot going for it. It's a great sword. It's just going to require some more time putting into it. So as mentioned, I have done most of this with the brass brushes. I've not been using the soft brass brush so much. I've been using the harder brass brush, and I have, to start things off, been using the steel brush. So I've been removing the top layer of corrosion with the steel brush now, and then moving on to the harder brass brush. By doing it that way, it means that I'm scratching off the top layer of the corrosion without being too offensive to the steel underneath. So I'm kind of getting that top layer off with the steel and then switching to the brass. So let's carry on. I'm going to work my way around this edge now here. So I've done quite a hell of a lot of scrubbing there. I've got it to a position where I'm happy to leave it for now, and I've given it an oil over with ballistol before I finish. So I've just covered the metalwork of the hilt with ballistol, which will help kind of you know, stabilise it, arrest any further rusting, and of course makes it look good because it kind of oils the surface of the metal, gives it this nice dark colour that you can see there. So I've removed the worst of the rust from the hilt. There's still quite a lot of work that I'd like to spend on this, but it's 100 times better than it was when I started, so I'm quite happy to stop there for now. Some bits are looking particularly good. The back strap and the pommel I'm very happy with. The underneath of the guard still has quite a crust on it. The outside of the guard is much better than it was, but it can be better. Anyway, I'm happy with it where it is for now. As I mentioned, when I get around to it, I will do a chemical treatment on the scabbard, and I'll film that for you guys so you can see how that goes and how I do it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we will see this sword, the Prosser Bombay horse artillery sword, again, I'm sure. Thanks for watching. Cheers. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.